It was a mild October night, one of those nights when the clock seems to drag and the silence of the hospital corridors weighs like a muffled blanket. Julia, a nurse on duty for almost 8 years, was spending her time reviewing charts in the emergency room triage area. It was her third cup of coffee of the night as she tried to shake off the accumulated fatigue of the week. At that moment, her life was a sequence of night shifts, rushing to her daughter's school, and the constant feeling that the days were repeating themselves. There was nothing extraordinary about that night. Until then, the shifts at Viñedo Municipal Hospital were almost always predictable. Minor emergencies, elderly people with high blood pressure, and the occasional more tense situation. Nothing there prepared the team for what was about to happen. It was just past 2 in the morning when the automatic emergency room doors opened by themselves, without the sound of a siren, without the usual noise of an ambulance. Julia lifted her eyes from the paperwork and, for a second, thought she was seeing things. But no, there he was. A large dog, a German shepherd, with fur stained by dry mud and eyes deep with exhaustion, walked calmly to the center of the reception. In his mouth, he held with extreme care a bundle wrapped in an old dirty cloth with its edges torn. He did not growl, did not bark, did not show fear. He just walked, determined, as if he knew exactly where he was and what he needed to do. For a moment, no one moved. The air grew heavy, as if something sacred was taking place. It was then that he stopped in front of Julia and gently placed the bundle on the floor with an almost human delicacy. Julia instinctively bent down, her heart racing without her fully understanding why. She carefully untied the improvised knots of the cloth, noticing the rough texture and the strong smell of earth and humidity impregnated in the fabric. When she finally loosened the last knot, the world seemed to stop for a few seconds. There, among the soiled folds, was a baby. Small, fragile, with chapped lips and parched skin, the thin body revealed clear signs of malnutrition and severe dehydration. The breathing was short and irregular, as if life was hanging by a thread, clinging to its last reserves of strength. Julia took a second to process what she saw before pressing the emergency button on the wall and shouting for the doctors. The room transformed into a whirlwind of voices, hurried footsteps, and urgent commands. Doctors appeared as if emerging from the walls, each assuming a role, while the baby was quickly taken for intensive care. As the team raced to stabilize the child, the dog remained there, motionless, sitting next to the stretcher carrying the baby. His eyes, dark and steady, followed every movement of the professionals with an unsettling calm, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. There was no agitation in his posture, nor any fear. It was as if he had fulfilled his mission and was now waiting for the outcome. Even with adrenaline coursing through her veins, Julia couldn't help but cast quick glances at him, trying to understand where he had come from, how he knew the way to the hospital, and why he had entrusted that baby to them. There was something in the animal's expression that defied any logical explanation, a mixture of ancient wisdom and contained sadness, as if he carried the weight of something much greater than a simple delivery. The baby was taken to the pediatric emergency room and within minutes was intubated, receiving IV fluids and being monitored by an entire team working in silent concentration, but with visible tension on their faces. The on-duty pediatrician, Dr. Henrique, a meticulous and skeptical man, one of those who only bowed to concrete evidence, observed the vital signs with a furrowed brow. He had never seen a situation like that. A baby on the brink of collapse, brought in by a dog who, in absolute silence, seemed to understand every beat of that heart monitor. Between procedures, Julia noticed that the dog still hadn't moved. He remained near the room's door, alert, almost like a sentinel. Someone suggested taking him outside, but no one had the courage to move him. It was as if he was part of that scene, as if his presence was indispensable to that moment. An invisible link between life and whatever was left of that child's hope. When they finally managed to stabilize the baby, by a thread, relief took over the team. It was too early to say if he would survive, but at least now there was a chance. Julia left the room with tense shoulders and teary eyes, taking a deep breath as if trying to return to her body after a whirlwind. As she passed by the dog again, she stopped for a few seconds, knelt beside him and, on an almost instinctive impulse, stroked his head. The animal did not react. He simply remained there, steadfast, with a look that seemed to silently express gratitude. It was at that moment that the hospital security guard, Ottavio, a man with a raspy voice and a shuffling gait, known for his insatiable curiosity, approached, watching the scene with half-closed eyes. "This creature is not ordinary," he murmured almost to himself. "There's some story here that we still don't know." It was Ottavio who first raised the hypothesis. He said that he had seen that look before. Not in ordinary dogs, but in patrol dogs, the so-called retirees, who after years of service were left with civilians or often ended up abandoned. This one carries himself like he was trained. Look at how he positions himself, how he observes. "He's not a stray," he murmured, approaching calmly. The German shepherd did not growl, but he also did not show any sign of receptiveness. He simply kept his head held high, vigilant, as if he knew he still needed to protect something. Ottavio's suspicion quickly spread among the team. One of the residents suggested calling the police to investigate the dog's origin and, more importantly, to understand where that baby had come from. The hospital management agreed, and within half an hour, 2 civilian police officers arrived to follow the case. When they entered the reception area and encountered the dog, they also noticed something unusual. One of the agents, a tall, thin man with an alert look named Leandro, immediately recognized the posture. This one was trained, you can bet on it. While they collected information from the medical team and observed the first records of the baby, Leandro had an unconventional idea. He decided to follow the dog's instinct. He cautiously approached and showed an improvised collar made from a piece of a fabric belt left in the reception. Without resistance, the German shepherd allowed him to put the strap on, and as soon as he felt a slight tug, turned calmly and began to walk toward the door. It was as if he had been waiting for that invitation. The police officers exchanged quick glances and decided to follow him, along with Ottavio, who insisted on going along, claiming that he wanted to see where this creature would take us. It was the early hours of the morning. The city was still asleep, and that silent group, 2 police officers and a security guard with a guide dog, crossed the empty streets like characters in a story none of them could have imagined living. The path taken by the dog was precise. He did not hesitate at intersections, did not stop to sniff sidewalks or bark at doors. He walked with a clear direction, crossing narrow streets and dimly lit alleys, as if he had mapped out every curve in his mind. After about 15 minutes, he turned into a forgotten lane between 2 abandoned buildings in the eastern sector of the city. There, at the end of that dark corridor, was a small house with peeling bricks, a sagging gate, and windows covered with cloth. The front door was only ajar, and the smell of mold and dampness filled the air. The dog stopped in front of the entrance, sat down, and just looked back as if to say, "This is it." The police officers exchanged looks and, carefully, took out their flashlights and entered the building. The interior of the house seemed frozen in time. It was clear that someone had lived there, but not by choice, out of lack of alternatives. There was a makeshift bed on the floor with dirty sheets, a rusty baby carriage, a pot still containing remnants of dry rice, and a torn blanket, tossed in the corner. But what caught the most attention was a corner of the room, an improvised space with cushions and simple toys, where the baby probably spent most of his time. On top of a cardboard box rested a hastily written note, with trembling handwriting and stains of dried tears. Leandro read it aloud in a low, sorrowful tone. "If anyone finds this baby, take care of him. I can't do it anymore. He is all I have, and this dog will know where to take him. He is the only one I still trust." For a moment, silence fell again, heavy and profound. Ottavio discreetly wiped his eyes. It wasn't just a rescue. It was the culmination of a desperate plea for help, delivered into the paws of a dog no one knew, but who carried the last hope of a ruined mother. The house left no doubts. It was where the baby had lived, and it was from there that the dog had embarked on his silent mission. While the police photographed the scene and collected everything that could serve as a clue, Max, as he was beginning to be called, remained seated at the door, watching with the same calm he had carried from the hospital. He did not advance, did not search the space. It was as if he already knew that that chapter had ended there. Leandro found, on one of the peeling walls, a photo taped on, almost faded. It was an image of a young woman smiling next to Max when he was still a puppy. The background was a simple yet well-kept backyard. The young woman must have been in her early 20s, and the sparkle in her eyes contrasted with the miserable surroundings of the house. "She must be the mother," he said, putting the picture in a plastic evidence bag. It was necessary to find her, not only for the investigation, but because, after that night, no one could dissociate the child from that story of abandonment and courage. Following the logic of the clues, the police returned to the hospital to try to cross-reference information with social records, previous visits, or any data that could help, but nothing. No history of the woman, no name. It was then decided to return to the neighborhood of the abandoned property and talk with nearby residents. Most were initially suspicious, but an elderly lady with a choked voice and eyes deep with the look of one who has seen much in life revealed that yes, there had been a young woman living there for a few months. She said that the woman rarely went out, always wore worn-out clothes, and had a distant look, as if she no longer belonged to that place. She only went out with the baby in her arms or with the dog by her side, a beautiful, well-behaved, obedient dog. Everyone found that strange, she recounted, looking at Max, who recognized her with a brief wag of his tail. It was a thread of connection with the baby's mother, and perhaps with a story even sadder than everyone imagined. The lady pointed the way to a small park a few blocks away, where she said she had seen the young woman a few times, sitting silently on a bench near the broken playground equipment. Leandro and his partner went there, and indeed, they found her. She was sitting alone, with hunched shoulders and eyes lost in emptiness. Her clothes were as described by the neighbors: an old sweatshirt, too large for her thin frame, and a pair of worn-out slippers. When the police cautiously approached, she did not react immediately. It was as if she was trapped in a heavy silence, as if she no longer expected to be noticed by anyone. It was only when Leandro mentioned the baby, "We found your son. He's alive," that her eyes filled with tears in an instant. She brought her hands to her mouth, as if to stifle a cry that never came out. She collapsed right there on the bench, crying silently, her body trembling in small, contained spasms, as if even her pain had learned to quiet down over time. Rachel, that was the name she revealed between sobs, told her story in broken sentences, trying to organize her own tragedy into words. She said that she had been abandoned by the baby's father during the pregnancy, that she had been living as a guest until she was eventually thrown out, and that she couldn't get a job due to a lack of documents and because she was always carrying her son in her arms. She recounted that in recent days she could barely eat and that everything she had was given to the baby. She said that she cried every night, not knowing what to do, until she made the most painful decision of her life, to trust the only being that had never let her down. "I knew he would find help. Max was always different. He understands everything, everything," she repeated, clenching her fists as if still trying to convince herself that she wasn't dreaming. Leandro, who had seen much in his career, swallowed hard. That story was not just about abandonment, it was about someone who, even at the absolute limit, still found a gesture of love and was lucky enough to have a four-legged hero by her side. Rachel was taken to the hospital under police guidance, still fragile, with a lost look, as if she wasn't sure that all of it was real. On the way, she held the faded portrait that Leandro had given her, the photo of her and Max, from when there was still some light in her life. Upon arriving at the hospital, her legs gave out. She needed support from Julia, who was waiting at the entrance. There was something silent and supportive in the nurse's embrace, a subtle but genuine gesture that seemed to say, "You are not alone." When she entered the pediatric ICU corridor, the sound of monitors and the smell of antiseptic overwhelmed her senses. But nothing was more impactful than the moment she saw her little son's body, still connected to wires and tubes but breathing. Rachel approached slowly, as if afraid to break that moment. She touched the baby's tiny hand with trembling fingers and for the first time in many days, smiled. A contained, tired smile, but a real one. The reunion moved even the most experienced staff. Julia, watching the scene from the doorway, felt her eyes fill with tears for the third time that night. Max, who until then had been lying near the reception, got up and walked to the ICU window, stopping exactly where Rachel was. He did not bark, did not whine. He just watched intently, as if he needed to confirm with his own eyes that his mission had been accomplished. Rachel, upon noticing his presence, approached the glass, knelt down, and rested her forehead against it, looking at the dog with a mix of guilt and gratitude. "Thank you, my friend," she whispered. And for the first time, Max wagged his tail more vigorously, as if he too understood that that cycle had finally closed. There was a connection there that needed no scientific explanation. It was pure instinct, trust, and a silent love that had saved 2 lives in that early morning. In the days that followed, the hospital became a kind of meeting point for intersecting. Stories, the case of the baby rescued by a dog, soon spread through the corridors, then through the streets, until it gained space in the local press. People wanted to know who that dog was, where he came from, how he had managed something so incredible. Rachel remained hospitalized for a few more days, not only to monitor her son's recovery, but also because her body demanded rest and care, something she herself had long neglected. Social workers began to accompany her closely, offering legal support, guidance on social benefits, and even help with regularizing her documentation. For the first time in months, she began to feel that there was a chance to start over, even if slowly, even if with fear. Max, for his part, became an official presence at the hospital. Even without formal authorization, no one dared to bar him. He was given an improvised little bed next to the reception, and daily he made his discreet rounds, as if he was still on duty. The hospitalized children were enchanted by him, patients silently petted him, and the staff began to care for him with affection. Food, baths, attention. It was as if the entire hospital had adopted Max. Or perhaps it was the other way around. Leandro, who continued investigating the animal's background, discovered with the help of a fellow officer that Max had indeed been a police dog, retired 3 years earlier. His former handler had passed away, and since then he had disappeared. He was not just an impromptu hero. He was a trained, experienced hero who had now found a new purpose, perhaps even nobler than the previous one. And there was something poetic, though no one said it out loud, in seeing a combat dog transform into a silent guardian of fragile lives. The community also reacted intensely to the story. Some neighbors from the area where Rachel lived began organizing donations of clothes, diapers, food, and hygiene items. A local bakery offered her free breakfast for a month. A group of volunteers mobilized to find temporary shelter until she could secure a decent place to live with her son. Rachel, still frightened by so much commotion, was slow to believe that it was all real. She carried within her a natural distrust, built by repeated disappointments. But little by little, she let her guard down. She accepted the help, smiled more often, and even began talking with other mothers in the pediatric ward. It was one step at a time, but they were firm steps. The shadow that had been following her began to dissipate, and although there were still days when fear tightened around her chest, now she knew she was no longer alone. Max, loyal as ever, never left her side. Even when Rachel was discharged and taken with her son to a temporary shelter, the dog went along. The social worker who was handling the case made sure to include that condition in the process. Wherever Rachel and the baby were, Max would be there too. The hospital organized a small, symbolic farewell, complete with an honorary employee badge for the dog, special dog food, and even a new blanket for his little bed. Julia was one of the last to say goodbye. She knelt beside him, hugged his neck tightly, and whispered, "You saved more than one life here, you know." He simply rested his snout on her hand, as he always did when he understood that human words carried something important. And that's how Max left the hospital. Not as a mere dog, but as a silent symbol of everything that humanity sometimes forgets it still has: compassion, courage, and the instinct to care. Time passed, and with it came new challenges, but also new possibilities. Rachel gradually rebuilt her routine with the help of social services and a local NGO that supported mothers in vulnerable situations. She managed to get her documents in order, started a professional course, and later was hired as an administrative assistant at a small company partnered with the social program that assisted her. The baby, officially baptized as Miguel, a name Rachel said she had chosen during her pregnancy, but never had the courage to register, grew up healthy, full of energy, and with an impressive bond with Max. The dog, now advanced in years, seemed to have found peace in his new life. He slept peacefully next to the crib, followed every step of Miguel around the house, and remained vigilant whenever there was any strange movement. It was as if he knew that this was his last great mission, and that he still needed to carry it out until the end. Despite the hardships, Rachel never stopped recounting the story of that night, not out of vanity, but out of gratitude. She always said that Max had done for her what no human being was capable of doing: to believe, to act, and to protect. She detailed how he crossed the city with the baby in his mouth, how he stayed firm by the stretcher at the hospital, and how he seemed to understand everything happening around him. And whoever listened, even the most skeptical, was moved. The story had already been told in interviews, local reports, and even in an independent documentary produced by journalism students. But none of that mattered as much as what Rachel said in a low voice every time she looked at Miguel playing in the yard. "If it weren't for him, my son wouldn't be here, and honestly, maybe neither would I." Time, inevitable in its passage, began to weigh on Max. His steps were no longer as agile, and his eyes, once alert to every movement, now carried a more serene, almost contemplative shine. Even so, he continued to follow his routine, waking up with Miguel, lying beside him during afternoon naps, and softly barking when he sensed that Rachel needed a little extra strength on difficult days. A year after the rescue, he began to show signs of deep exhaustion, the kind only very loyal dogs feel when they realize their mission is coming to an end. Rachel, noticing this, began gently preparing Miguel, explaining that even heroes rest, that even guardians need peace. It was on a quiet morning, under the soft sun that invaded the yard, that Max simply lay down next to the chair where Miguel was playing and never woke up again. He passed away in silence, just as he had appeared that night, with dignity, dedication, and purpose. The emptiness that followed was immense but not painful. It was a kind of respectful silence, filled with gratitude. Rachel buried Max in the yard, under the tree where he used to lie on the hottest afternoons. She made a simple little plaque with her own hands on which she wrote, "Max, our savior." And there, in that small patch of earth, rested not only a dog, but an entire story of resilience, love, and transformation. Life went on. Miguel grew up hearing about the friend who saved him when he could barely cry. And Rachel, despite her scars, learned that new beginnings are made not only of opportunities, but also of unexpected gestures, like that of a mud-covered dog crossing the early morning alone, carrying hope between his teeth. Enjoyed the video? Please like, subscribe, share, and hit the notification bell to stay updated.